Hi there, my name is Jack Wallen and I'm here for another Linux 101. Now, before I get into the subject at hand, I need to say this. I had to send my DJI LiDAR off for repairs because it's on the fritz. It is no longer reading my gimbal, so I can't control the one thing that I use it for, which is autofocus. The irony being that within the same 6 months, I had to also send my DJI gimbal in for repair because the touchscreen decided it didn't want to work anymore. Technology. When it works, it's great. When it doesn't work, Okay, so I was going to talk about a specific subject, but then within the last few days, something happened within the Linux community, and I decided I wanted to address that. But then I realized, this is a Linux 101 video series. Maybe they need to hear about something in which they can learn, from which they can learn. But then I realized I can put those two things together to make one happy video. And here we are. So, back in the early days when I was first started using Linux, late 90s, early 2000s, one of the things I noticed, one of the things everybody noticed, was things were kind of dividing. The Linux community was divided. And I think that it started with the VI Emacs. I say war, but I don't want to use that term because it's, nah. They were pitting themselves against one another. Each one saying, our text editor is better than theirs. And that's what they are. VI and Emacs are text editors. And there were people up in arms about this for text editors. Now, I've been using Nano for years because I don't like VI or Emacs because they're just too cumbersome. I don't want to have to hit shift semicolon and then right quit to save and quit a file. With Nano, I just do Control X, Y, and we're done. There are just so many key combinations to remember with those editors. But people that used either VI or Emacs were militant about their editor being the best. And guess what? That divisiveness started to trickle into other areas of the Linux community. It went to browsers, everything. And it also started to hit the desktop environments to the point where people were saying, your desktop environment sucks. Why? Because it's not ours. Really? Really? Now, I know that a lot of people believe that competition breeds innovation. But I would say just the opposite. I would say that collaboration breeds innovation. Imagine, just imagine. Let me set the stage for you. You have the developers of GNOME and the developers of KDE Plasma. And they say, enough of this bickering, enough of this, enough. Let's come together and see what we can create. Now imagine the desktop environment that would be created by the GNOME team and the KDE Plasma team. I would venture to say that it would be pretty darn spectacular. Right? So the problem is we have, for various and sundry reasons, of which I'm not going to mention, we have reached a point in humanity where divisiveness is starting to become our default. And nothing good will come of it. Nothing. And the divisiveness of the Linux community goes all the way to the top. And I would say to anybody that's involved with Linux, if we want this operating system to truly succeed, we have to work together. We have to work together as a community. right? Not a bunch of divided little islands and silos that really just want to take out the other silos and islands. We've got to work together. We've got to promote, and we've got to be willing to cross and build bridges. As someone who covers Linux and open source, I take very seriously the idea of not being biased within the world of Linux. So I'm not going to come out and say, well, GNOME's the best desktop environment. Although I use a desktop environment that is based on GNOME, which is Pop! OS. Well, it's not really the desktop environment, that's the operating system, but they're developing Cosmic desktop. You know what I'm talking about. But I don't come out and say that GNOME and GNOME-based desktops are better than Cinnamon or Pantheon or Budgie or KDE Plasma or any of them. Now let me tell you why. Because everybody's needs and desires are different. That's just the truth. For example, and I'm fairly transparent about this, even when I'm writing things. For me, and I know this might seem silly to you, but for me, aesthetics is really important. I want a desktop that looks really cool. I want a modern desktop. I want a modern minimal desktop, which is why GNOME suits me. But at the same time, I see the great appeal to other desktops. And this is where it gets a little fun for me, because let's just say, for example, KDE Plasma releases a new version, right? And so here I am writing my articles on the GNOME desktop, and I'm testing like KDE Neon in VirtualBox, and I'm using this new release, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this looks incredible. This could be one of the best looking desktops I've ever used. And I've said that about others like Budgie and Pantheon. So I can appreciate what other developers are doing and respect, and even at times think, maybe I do want to switch to KDE Plasma now. Maybe it's time, because let's face it, it's beautiful. And that's what I want to talk about right now, KDE Plasma. Good segue, huh? So KDE originally started out as KDE, which stood for the K Desktop Environment. Fun times, right? Now, I remember when I went to my very first Linux convention, I think it was 1999, and I believe it was at the Research Triangle in Durham, I think. And I remember meeting the KDE people and how cool they were and how excited they were about their desktop. And at the time, I was still using GNOME. I think GNOME 1. I don't remember which dot it was, but GNOME 1. And I remember seeing KDE and thinking, well, I like that. It's nice, but it looks a bit too much like Windows XP. Or it's just the same kind of metaphor that Windows uses. And there's not a whole lot differentiating it from Windows. So I thought, well, okay, it's a decent desktop, but I probably will never use it. And that's not to say I didn't test it and try it and all that. And then at some point, the KDE desktop started to get a little bit overweight and bloated, and it was slow, and it was every time you would and I remember specifically early on, I remember thinking, every time I move a window in this desktop, I'm afraid it's going to crash, because that's how it felt. It was unstable, it was slow, it was clunky. But again, that was early on. And then very, very, very slowly, like glacial slow, KDE evolved into KDE Plasma, and it began to get a lot better. The first thing I noticed was that all of a sudden, it was really stable. I could move windows around and it didn't matter. They were not going to crash. They were stable. They were rock solid. But it was still a little slow. And then all of a sudden, it started to get really fast. Like really, really fast. Like GNOME level fast. And that was when it started to become more than relevant. It started to really compete with GNOME, because GNOME, for the longest time, was looking like it was going to be the desktop for Linux. And KDE all of a sudden said, nay, nay, we're here too, so make way. And I think it was when KDE 5 was released, I was really impressed. Like, impressed in a way that I hadn't been impressed in a long time. And then, well, let me hold on just a second. One of the things that KDE 5 did was it introduced a lot of really interesting features that other desktops hadn't considered. Take, for example, KDE Activities. Now, this is probably one of the least used features in KDE, and quite honestly, I'm surprised they have kept it around. Or I'm also surprised they haven't. Well, I'll tell you that in a second. What is KDE Activities? Well, essentially, it's a way to customize individual workspaces such that that particular workspace has a workflow, and I hate to use that term, but people in the tech industry get it. So you can create a specific workflow within this one activity that is dedicated to a specific task. You might have, let's say you're a developer and you want an activity specific for developing. So you would create the activity, and then you could configure that activity to work a certain way. Like you could add specific widgets to that activity. You could customize other things in that activity such that they function well with that particular workflow. And then you could have another workflow like social media. Like, let's say you do have a social media activity, and to simplify that, you might add a widget for Facebook or Blue Sky. I don't know if there is a widget for Blue Sky yet, or God forbid X. And I hope you're not still using X, because it's a big dumpster fire. But you could add those widgets so that when you wanted to post something or read something, you just have to check the widget. You wouldn't have to go to the website. So activities, here's the thing that I believe that activities would benefit from, would take them to the next level. As it stands, the one thing you cannot do with activities is customize a panel for that activity. Let's say you have an activity and the workflow dictates or prefers that the panel is on the left edge of the display instead of the bottom. Well, if you go to that activity and you change the position of the panel to the side, if you go to another activity, the panel is going to be on the side. It would be really cool if you could customize panels to that level based on a specific workflow within an activity. But you can't right now. I don't know if that'll ever happen, if it's even possible. Not a developer, not a KDE developer. So I don't know, but it would be really cool. But you can customize wallpaper and theme and all that to a specific activity. And it's pretty cool. Especially if you use Linux workspaces. Now, I don't know if you know about workspaces, but you should, because Linux has had them forever. Unlike Mac OS or Chrome OS or Windows, Linux invented the virtual workspace, the virtual desktop. Essentially is you can have multiple virtual desktops such that you can open up task-specific applications to one workspace and then switch. So like you have apps for development in one workspace, apps for social media in another workspace, apps for productivity in another workspace. Just switch between them. So workspaces are really cool. So imagine if you elevate workspaces to another level, call them activities, and you can customize each workspace specific to that task. That's KDE Plasma. And KDE Plasma does a lot of really cool little things, especially if you're like me and aesthetics is really important. You can get a nice blur, nice glass effects. The floating panel is really cool. That happens somewhere in KDE Plasma 6. I can't remember which one, but the floating panel is really cool. And the funny thing about that is it doesn't really serve a purpose. It's not like the floating panel does anything different than the standard panel. It just looks different. It just looks more modern. And I think that's one of the best things about KDE Plasma is that it's kind of the leader in the Linux community with regards to aesthetics on the desktop. You can configure a KDE desktop to look gorgeous in ways that GNOME can't touch, literally cannot touch. And I know that there's always this argument, what's the best looking Linux distribution? And for a long time it was Deepin, and then all of a sudden people are like, oh, you probably shouldn't use Deepin. And then Deepin all of a sudden kind of migrated toward the mundane. And Deepin is almost more like Budgie now. Not that Budgie's mundane, Budgies can be really beautiful. But KDE Plasma, I would say, right now, at this point in time, is the most elegant Linux desktop on the market. So if aesthetics are important to you, KDE should definitely be considered as your desktop. And especially because it's not just beautiful, it performs incredibly well, it's very stable, and it's simple to use. And that's another beautiful thing about KDE Plasma, is that anyone, and I do literally mean anyone, if you've used a computer, any operating system, you can log into a KDE desktop and know exactly what you're doing. Now, you probably aren't going to be able to get really deep into the customizations of KDE Plasma because they can be a little bit overwhelming because there's a lot of them. But if you just use it, it's a no-brainer. It really is. And not only that, but it's fun to use. And there are a lot of desktops that can lay claim to we're the most user-friendly. And for example, the Cinnamon desktop is often considered one of the most user-friendly desktops. But the thing about Cinnamon, and I don't disagree with that. I do not disagree with that. Cinnamon is incredibly easy. It's incredibly familiar. It's not complicated. But what Cinnamon lacks is personality. I know that sounds silly. Why would a computer desktop environment need personality? Well, it does. What sets Cinnamon apart from Mate? Not much. You know, it's just a traditional desktop metaphor. KDE Plasma has a lot of personality. A lot. And I think that's a wonderful thing. And I think more desktop environments need to follow that model. If you're a developer for a desktop environment within Linux, ask yourself this question. What is the personality of our desktop environment? If you had to relate your desktop environment to a human personality, what would it be? I mean, is Cinnamon like an accountant with a pocket protector and, you know, Docker pants and a button-down shirt that just gets things done? I don't know. Is KDE this perky cheerleader that's pretty and does all the things? And I don't know. But ask yourself that question. What is our personality? Because I believe that each, if you really dive in deep enough into them, you could associate a personality with just about every Linux desktop environment. Like the i9, I think it's i9 window manager, the tiling window manager. It's almost like an arrogant engineer that is absolutely convinced their way of doing things is the right way of doing things, and no other way of doing things matters. GNOME is like a Nordic minimalist. You could go through every one of the Linux desktop environments and associate a personality with them. And it would be really cool if the developers did that themselves and allowed that personality to help drive them forward and make decisions for their desktop environment. But seriously, back to KDE Plasma. If you've never tried KDE Plasma, I highly recommend you do. And to do that, I would recommend you use KDE Neon, which is the distribution which is based on Ubuntu, and it always has the most recent version of KDE Plasma and all of the related software. And it will give you a really good look at what KDE can be and can do. Plus, it's just gorgeous. It really is. Every part of it is gorgeous. And KDE Neon performs really well. Now, I don't know if I would suggest using KDE Neon as your daily desktop operating system, mostly because it's so bleeding edge. And so if you want one that's a little bit more stable, go with Kubuntu, which is the Ubuntu spin with KDE Plasma. And spend some time with KDE. And I guarantee you, at some point, if you give it enough time, at some point you're going to go, I really like this. And this desktop environment is spoiling me. I don't know if I want to go back to what I was using before. Because I've done that so many times. When I'm testing something new about KDE Plasma, I'm like, daggone it. KDE Plasma is really trying hard to make me switch from GNOME. And that's a great thing, because they're both great desktop environments. And there's nothing wrong with me saying that. I am proud to say that. I think I can find something positive about every Linux desktop environment. And I think that that is what the community needs. I think the Linux community needs to have more people willing to say, I use GNOME, but I think KDE is freaking awesome. We need, as a whole, we need to embrace each other. We need to embrace the work that other people are doing, respect it, and honor it. Because, let's face it, the majority of Linux developers are doing it out of the love for doing it and the love of Linux, because most of them are not getting paid. So when you start using GNOME or KDE Plasma or Cinnamon or Pantheon or Budgie or whatever, remember that. Remember that the developers that work on this are not making any money working on this. They're doing it because they love to do it. And that's an honorable thing. And so keep that in mind when you try another piece of software that's not your normal, and be willing to find the positive in it, because the Linux community needs more of that. Because if we keep getting divided, if you keep dividing us in half, and then we're in quarters, and then we're in eighths, and then we're in sixteenths, and then we're in 32nds, we're not going to be able to work together. Just remember, rising tide is supposed to float all boats, not drown every boat but yours. Remember that. So anyway, try KDE Plasma. It is a beautiful, fast, stable desktop environment that is easy to use and gorgeous. It is the prom queen of Linux desktop environments. Anyway, thank you so much for spending a little bit of your time with me. I know how precious it is. You're probably busy, but hey, you know, it's Linux and we all love it and we want to talk about it and we want to listen to other people talking about it. So you just did that. Huzzah! Thank you, and I hope that every one of you and everyone you know and love have a wonderful, wonderful day.